our last presentation in the Leadership and Collaboration track, I'm excited to introduce Lauren Stern, Director of Global Insights at iRobot. In her presentation, Lauren showcases how product teams can use research methodology in workshops in order to support the exploratory, definition, and design process internally.
Hey everybody, my name is Lauren and I am Director of Global Insights at iRobot. In particular, my work focuses on our new products as well as existing products that are already in the market throughout our product development lifecycle. So today we're going to be focusing on workshops for discovery. And in particular, what I mean by that is that I want to talk to you about some of the ways that we bring play and creativity into our development process, both internally with our stakeholders and externally with our user experience research participants, to get us outside of the box in how we think about autonomy in our lives to help us eventually design better products. So let's get started. Before we dive in, I want everyone to just take a minute and think about an interaction that you have every day. Think about what that experience is like for you, where this interaction happens, what the outcomes often are, any moments of frustration or joy or success that are associated with it. All right. Everybody have that in mind? So what was that interaction? Maybe it was with another person, like a spin instructor or a barista. Or maybe it was with a device, whether it's talking to a voice assistant in your home or in your car, or yes, even a robot vacuum. These kinds of interactions are already becoming daily experiences. We interact with technology in so many ways, and so many of those interactions are really social interactions, which is something that hasn't always been true, but the more we integrate autonomy and some of these new capabilities like AI into our experiences, the more social these interactions become. Ultimately, autonomy is coming. Automation is coming for all of our devices, for many of the interactions throughout our days. And so it's important for us as parts of the technology world to think about these interactions and how we can build experiences that still feel human-centered, where we're building in autonomy that feels valuable to humans, that feels like it's adding something useful to the experience, and ultimately that it's still putting our users in the center of what we're doing, rather than focusing on the technology itself. Ultimately, user experience and product teams have a lot of power to steer the direction that our everyday interactions are going to go. So let's use that power for good. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are also business reasons for doing this. We've seen in a lot of our research that when we build a really social, emotionally engaging experience with autonomous devices, there are a lot of business KPIs that get a boost. So for example, customer satisfaction goes up when people feel emotionally engaged with their device. So as we think about ways to build better technology, it's not just because I'm a user experience researcher that I'm advocating to do this. It is because of that, but it's also because we care about this from a business standpoint. This benefits the business when we do a really good job at how we design these future experiences. But when I say design future experiences, that can mean a whole bunch of different things. Today, we're going to focus on one method that we have in our toolkit, and that's workshops. These are all different kinds of creative activities that get people out of their comfort zones and have us really thinking about new ways that we could bring autonomy into the world. I'm going to break this down in a couple of different ways. First, we're going to talk about some core principles that I use across all of these activities as I develop them, and then I'm going to show you two different activities that we've used in the past at iRobot to give you a sense of what this can look like in practice. And as we dive in and talk about this, I want you to think about the audience that you are going to be working with if you choose to execute a workshop like this. At iRobot, we have two distinct groups of participants. On the one hand, we do a lot of these workshops internally as brainstorming exercises and ways to align members of our cross-functional teams. So thinking about product, user experience design, engineering, marketing. We invite folks from customer care. We try to get people from across the organization involved because it gives everybody enthusiastic alignment on the direction that we're headed. And because there are real outcomes to these sorts of projects, when we have those outcomes and we talk about how we got there, sometimes when we're being really creative like this, it can sound a little bit fluffy. And so by having a bunch of different stakeholders in the room and participating, we have advocates across the organization who can speak to the power of this type of exercise. So for internal audiences, this is about really pushing our boundaries, thinking about future designs, thinking about the future of our product space, and getting into the weeds of what that could look like. We also do these workshops externally as exercises within a larger user experience research session. This is very different than what we do internally in the way that we structure it. Typically, it's part of a one-on-one or small group interview, so it's a different setting, but it gives us a lot of the same things. It pushes our boundaries. It gets people to think outside the box of what they expect out of a research session. And it can really help break down any sort of discomfort or awkwardness around talking about technology. So we still get really powerful insights out of this, but we're just talking to people who don't work at our company. But for both of these audiences, we have some core principles that I use when I'm designing any exercise. Number one is to center our humans. And what I mean by that is that we want to keep our users in mind. This is human-centered design, essentially. So what this looks like is that when we're doing an internal workshop, I'll typically give homework. Yes, I give homework. And that looks like some sort of review of maybe user videos from sessions if we've done some research to support this work, or it might be reviewing personas or market segmentation data, different elements that our internal stakeholders are familiar with and that they're going to use to picture our users when we actually get into the room to do the brainstorm. So we're centering our humans in that way by thinking about these other documents, these other frameworks that we already have, or just watching videos and listening to our users' voices. If I'm working externally, we're doing this by talking to users. So that one's a little simpler. But again, we're really centering the humans. These are sessions that are focused on the person and not on the device. And I want to emphasize that, especially in the introduction to the session when I'm first onboarding the participant at the beginning of the interview. Number two is to make it social. And what I mean by this is that we as humans are experts in ourselves and how we engage in the world, even if we don't know it. And so when we're thinking about designing social experiences, ultimately, our experiences with technology, especially with autonomy, are already very social. Just by design, we as humans interact socially with the world. So when we think about an activity or getting feedback on something, it can be a little bit off-putting if we approach that from a really tech-focused way or a really device-focused way, especially in these very early-stage discovery sessions where we're trying to think about the future with things that don't exist yet. So structuring this around social interaction, social experiences, things we as humans are experts in, can be really valuable in kind of getting everyone out of the box and into a space where they can think more freely about the future. And number three is to warm up. So just like if you were going out for a run or if you were about to sing, you want to give your body and your brain time to adjust to this activity. And in this particular case, I'm talking more about theater or improv workshops, but we really want to get people outside their comfort zone. We want to get them comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this is true internally and externally. So internally, we might take this into a big activity, play a game. Zip, Zap, Zop, for example, is an improv game that we've used before. So we're going to take something that gets people being a little bit silly, using their bodies, communicating and engaging with the other people in the workshop, especially cross-functionally. You may not know everyone in the room. So this is a really good way to get everybody interacting and breaking down those walls really fast. Externally, a warm-up may look very different. It may be the beginning of the interview. It might be a tour of the space. There's all sorts of different things that we might do here, but basically we want to get people comfortable and outside of what they expect out of a session before we actually break into the activity where we're going to try and collect our data. Connecting to that is the number 4 is embrace the silly. I mentioned getting a little bit silly and a little bit goofy. Ultimately, the goal is not just to have fun here, but the more we can sort of break away from our traditional roles as researchers, designers, developers, marketers, the easier it is to be really creative and to have really open-ended conversations and ideas. So we know from the research that we've done that talking about technology, especially autonomy and robots, can feel a little bit awkward for people. And so the more we can break that down and kind of own it, the easier it is going to be to get folks to open up and participate in the process. And finally, we want to let technology go at first. And what I mean by this is that we are going to start any of our workshops, any of our exercises without thinking about technology. I think it's very easy when we're focused on product development to get really caught up in the constraints and restrictions and technological feasibility of what we're talking about. But when we're early in the process, thinking about discovery here. We don't want to do that. We want to really think big. We want to set a North Star. And the easiest way to do this is to just not talk about technology. We're not going to worry about it. It'll come back in later. And one of the case studies I'm going to show you today does bring in some of those constraints. But for the beginning, when you're really open-ended in the process, early in discovery, you want to let the technology go and just focus on the experience or the scenario that you're trying to design for. Which brings us to our case studies. So today I want to talk about 2 workshops that I love to do. I've used both of these internally as well as externally as part of research sessions. And in both cases, I've facilitated the exercise. So we're going to talk about what they look like just generally, and then I'll get into some of the ins and outs of whether you're doing it with an internal group of stakeholders or an external participant setting. The first one is called Human-Robot Improv. I think you might be able to guess where we're going with that. It's an improv workshop. And the second one is called Crafting the Data. And that one is arts and crafts, but it's specifically focused on a slightly later stage in the process where you do want to bring in some of the constraints from the types of information that'll be available to you. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about improv. All right, up first, we're going to get on stage and talk a little bit about human-robot improv. So I really love this activity. It's a lot of fun, and I don't just say that because I was a theater kid. We always start by setting the scene. So when we do this externally, we usually go into people's homes. We'll do user sessions where we're in their space because I work on household robots, so that's what makes sense for us. Depending on what you're working on, you may or may not have access to the natural environment in which your device will be used, and that's okay. You can create a little set, you can set something up in a lab, you can decide collectively you're going to use your imaginations and not worry about the setting at all. But I think the important part here is that you're establishing a scenario and a location. Similar to any improv show you might have seen, you want to understand collectively in your brains where you are and what you're doing, even if those things aren't going to actually show up in the physical space. So you start by establishing those elements verbally or with a set or props or anything else. The next step is to act it out. So in this first round of improv, we want to have humans be all humans. What I mean by that is that we'll have different roles in the scene. So let's imagine that I'm ordering a drink at a coffee shop, and that's our scenario. So there's going to be a barista who's making my drink. I'm going to be ordering my drink. Maybe there are other patrons in the coffee shop as well that are doing some other things. All of those are humans doing human things. So we would act that out. We would act out that scene. But we're not just doing it to create something entertaining. We're really focused on what are the interactions here? What are the behaviors that I'm doing? And then especially for me as the orderer, as the user in this particular setting, what are my expectations and assumptions for what is going to happen when I walk into this scenario? And those are really important to chart as part of our output to the exercise. So we want to have a debrief either right away or after we do the second round of improv of all of these things that we're talking about. But we walk through it, we act this out as humans. Then we're going to do it again, but this time, at least one of the roles switches to being an autonomous device. So in this case, if I'm ordering coffee in a coffee shop, as the user, I'm still going to be a human, but maybe the barista becomes a robot. So we would do the same scene again, and this time there's 2 ways to do it. One is that you have a human be the robot, or have a puppet robot or some other kind of prop. Or you could have the human, the user, me in this case, just narrate through what you're doing. So when I order, I'm going to, provide that order verbally, and I would expect that the coffee machine would automatically make my drink, whatever it is. And the reason that we have these different options is because depending on the scenario and the environment, you may or may not want to have a human acting it out. You want to keep it really open-ended and see what someone suggests. So having that narration can be really valuable. But in either case, you're going to repeat the same debrief or do the debrief now at the end where you compare and contrast both. You want to look at any differences in the expectations, assumptions, how the user approached the interaction, what they expected the outcome to be, anything that can kind of shed light on, all right, when we did this with humans, what was that like? What did that look like? What was the outcome? What did we expect? And then how did that shift in reality with our autonomous experience? But then also, how did our expectations shift? What did we expect to be different? Are we trusting the robot less than the human? Do we trust it more? So you can start to think through some of those different settings as well and answer some of those questions as part of your output. This can help really highlight some of the goals and North Star behaviors, for example, that we might want our autonomous device to be able to handle. And then finally, we can repeat this as often as we want. So you can walk through multiple scenarios, multiple settings. Sometimes this can be really interesting if you've just done it with kind of a general path. Now you could introduce some sort of conflict and do it again. So what happens if the drink is wrong, for example? So you can do different kinds of things to mix it up, but the more you experiment and mix through different options, switch up the roles, the richer the data set that you'll get. Ultimately, the output of an exercise like this is a guided vision for where we want this feature, experience, or product to go, and information about certain elements that we might expect from a user, and that might even turn into certain workflows that we want to make sure we include in the experience, or particular interaction modes like voice or touchscreen control. So it gives us a lot of directional ideas that come out of this very open-ended thing where we were just focusing on user behavior. And at the end of a session like this, you want to document all of that. When I'm working internally, if we're doing this as a big group exercise, we document that together collaboratively at the end, and then we have this output that we're all aligned to. When we do this externally, we do it as part of one-on-one sessions typically. So we would take all of the outputs from all of those sessions and look at what the differences were or trends, the same way we would do any other sort of qualitative analysis. So we're pulling in all of these people together. So it's a slightly different process, but we're essentially getting to the same outcome. If we essentially fast forward in our development process slightly, we can talk about our next workshop, which is called Crafting the Data. This is arts and crafts, and I love it. Basically, what we do here is that we're going to create a co-design space where we are building out our own interactions with the building blocks that we've assembled based on what we know is possible or we think is possible in the near future for something that we're actively developing. So the first step here is that as a team or with the right experts in the room, we make a list of all the elements that are possible. So let's say we're thinking about how a device might report back information based on a user query. We come up with all the different types of information here and we put them out as building blocks. And we might have dummy data that we use as part of this where we have some sample outputs, sample phrases, sample charts, sample other kinds of visualizations. We have them all out on paper, we cut them out, we make copies of them, so we have these stacks of building blocks available to us as our elements of the workshop. Then we're going to create a list of prompts. These are moments where we would expect an interaction to happen. Sometimes you may focus an entire session on one or two of these, and sometimes you might have 5 or 6. It just depends on your timing and how much you think you can get through, how complicated the exercise is. You might need to play around with this too, because some teams will be able to really get into the spirit of this very quickly and move fast, and other teams will need to kind of take it slow and be really methodical. But ultimately, you take your list of moments, and this is going to be your set of prompts for your workshop. Now, when you're actually ready to run your workshop, you have your group that gets started, and everybody gets some sort of template. So depending on your framework, whether it's a device or it's an app screen, for example, you have a template outline that you're going to fill out with all your different components, and you give everyone your starting prompt, and then they build from the building blocks how they would expect or ideally want this interaction to go. So they pick the bits that are important to them, that they would like to see, they place them in the order that they want them to show up, or if it's something like a conversation, you sort of build out the dialogue and build out your script. And you glue them down, you can color them in, you can star different ones with stickers that are especially important. You can really go wild with this, depending on what your team is going to be open to. And then those come out as design ideas. You can turn them into paper prototypes. It gives you a chance to talk through, as a next step, everything that was designed. So what did you build? Why did you pick those elements? What was important to you about them? Were there any gaps that you filled in, maybe something you wrote on a blank piece of paper? And then that helps us identify gaps in our plan. It helps us identify themes and what we know is important to us, at least in this workshop. And it helps us identify some ideas for different directions we might want to go with the design itself. When we do this externally, it's exactly the same process, but again, we tend to do this either in small group sessions or one-on-one sessions. And in both cases, we would have that discussion and talk through what it is that our participant put together. And that gives them a chance to explain their thought process to you and also to verbalize any elements that maybe they weren't really sure how to include or they debated between. It gives you a lot of that context of why that's so powerful in research. One additional note on this particular exercise is that while improv I find really tends to work better in person, there's just something about being in the room together that's really powerful. Crafting the data can work remotely. It is different. It feels less kinetic because you are looking at a screen, moving things around on a screen, but it's definitely possible. And we've done this both for group sessions internally and as part of external research. So let's talk a little bit about outcomes as our final step here. When we are doing these internal workshops, we are challenging our typical workflow. We are pushing ourselves and our stakeholders outside of what we typically define as our day jobs, as our work. And that can be really powerful for getting around assumptions and biases and really interrogating what we think is true about the products that we work on. So that in itself can be really powerful. But then beyond that, it really pushes us to center the user in our process. We're focusing on humans, on their behaviors, on their interactions. And that gets us, again, outside the bounds of technology. It forces us to think outside of the guardrails that we're usually so concerned with in terms of our constraints. And those outcomes can then be built into research stimuli for future research with external participants. So while that's not the main outcome of this kind of session, it can be really powerful as the next step. This also, because it brought everyone along in the process, if you had a cross-functional group, means that you come out of these sessions with something that everyone feels part of. Everyone contributed in some way. And that in itself provides ownership of the final design decisions that is really useful. And that in and of itself provides ownership of these decisions that we're making, of the future decisions, the future vision for the product, that is really powerful, especially for people who usually aren't involved in these early stages of design, like marketing. And then externally, we are again centering the humans in the process, which is super valuable because the humans are building the scenario, they're participating. But it also helps us understand how users engage with autonomy. And this can be very different than how users engage and experience other kinds of technology. There's something about the concept of autonomy or robotics or AI that feels different to us, especially when we're talking to people who know less about technology, who are less comfortable with it. And so this does two things. One, it helps us look at assumptions and biases that we might otherwise miss, and it gives us a really great sense of folks' impressions. And then second, for folks who are less familiar with technology or less comfortable discussing it, it gives them a way to break outside of that awkwardness and that feeling of not being an expert and get involved and give us really genuine feedback that ends up being super valuable. Ultimately, I really believe that technology is better when we get creative. The more we think about humans and their social interactions in how we develop autonomous experiences, the better our future technologies will be. So I challenge all of you to get out there and design your own workshops. You can use these exercises as a starting point, and if you do, I hope you'll tell me about them. But I also look forward to seeing all of the new and creative ways you approach design.
That concludes the Leadership and Collaboration track. A big thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise with DiscoConf. Next up, we'll have a short break and then conclude the day with our final keynote presentations.